Hello everyone. In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about the key milestones of responding to global environmental change. We're going to know what conferences enable the nations to work on climate change and what treaties have been signed to reduce the global warming trend. But before going into those details, let's review the climate change research a bit. We already discussed this that in 1824, French mathematician and physicist Joseph Fourier first started talking about something called the greenhouse effect. He proposed that energy reaching the planet as sunlight must be balanced by energy returning to space, since heat hit surface emit radiation. But some of that energy, he reasoned, must be held within the atmosphere and not returned to space, keeping the earth warm. He proposed that Earth's thin covering of air, as we know that is the atmosphere, acts the way a glass greenhouse would. Energy enters through the glass walls but is then trapped inside, much like a warm greenhouse. And in 1895, Svante Arrhenius, his calculations showed that if carbon dioxide levels were halved, global temperatures could decrease by about 5 degrees Celsius or 9 degrees Fahrenheit. He also found that if the carbon dioxide level can be made twice the current level, then the global temperature would increase by about 5 degrees Celsius. So he actually established a link between global warming or the greenhouse effect and also the carbon dioxide emission. And then in 1930, Guy Callender, another scientist, he hypothesized that industrial revolution started global warming. So which means that the human actions are responsible to increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And in 1958, a monitoring station was established by the Scripps Institutions of Oceanography on top of Hawaii's Mauna Loa Observatory. And there, in that observatory, the scientist named Charles Keeling, he was responsible to analyze the atmospheric carbon dioxide level. And the curve he represented is famously known as Keeling curve. And the Keeling curve and ice core data showed that how carbon dioxide increased in the atmosphere over the years. So by 1970, we had enough evidence that global warming is directly related to carbon dioxide gas emission and also some other greenhouse gas emission, and we also evidenced that human actions are responsible for global warming. So now it's time to action. In 1972, actually in 1968, the Sweden first suggested to the United Nations Economic and Social Council the idea of having a United Nations conference to focus on human interactions with the environment. And in 1972, the first conference on climate change took place, although the term climate change was not used back in that day. So this conference was famously known as Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. So in this conference, the countries that are participated, they made a declaration together, and that includes natural resources must be safeguarded, pollution must not exceed the environment's capacity to clean itself, damaging oceanic pollution must be prevented, development is needed to improve the environment, environmental policy must not hamper development, environmental education is essential, rational planning should resolve conflicts between environment and development. So from this declaration, you can see that we were trying to maintain a balance between environment and development. But you can, if you can read between the lines, you can understand that there is a little bit more priority was given to the development, not on environment. That is because development is definitely our always priority. Even today, we are trying to maintain a balance between the development and environment. But in 1972, the realization of the environmental impacts on our lives was not that much that is currently we have. We have a better understanding on the environment, and we found that we need development, but the development should not come at the cost of human well-being, human mental wealth, or human overall environment. And this human mental health, human well-being are directly related to environment. So in this way, in that conference, that was the first conference, we should not expect much, but still there was a priority was given to the development. But in that conference, we actually in Stockholm Conference on Human Environment, we first established the World Environment Day. It was established in 1972, but it started to celebrate it, from 1974. This World Environment Day it is celebrated on the 5th of June every year, and it is the United Nations principal vehicle for encouraging awareness and action for the protection of our environment. It was first held in 1974, and it has been a flagship campaign for raising awareness on emerging environmental issues from marine pollution, human overpopulation, and global warming to sustainable consumption and wildlife crime. It becomes a global platform for public outreach. Now, currently, over 143 countries celebrate this day annually. Each year, World Environment Day has a new theme that major corporations, NGOs, then communities, governments, and celebrities worldwide adopt to advocate environmental causes. In 1974, in the first World Environment Day, the theme was Only One Earth, and now in 2018, the theme is Beating Plastic Pollution. So in the Stockholm Conference, we also established the United Nations Environment Program. In short, it is UNEP. UNEP's work encompasses of assessing global, regional, and national environmental conditions and trends, developing international and national environmental instruments, strengthening institutions for the wise management of the environment. UNEP promotes international cooperation on environmental issues, provides guidance to the UN organizations, and through its scientific advisory groups, it encourages the international scientific community to participate in formulating policy for many of the United Nations environmental projects. In this way, UNEP becomes the voice for the environment within the United Nations system. So we had actually pretty good achievement in the first conference. We established the World Environment Day, and we also established this United Nations Environment Program. Now, another important conference was held in 1985 in Austria, the Vienna Convention for Protection of Ozone Layer. It was held when a hole in the stratosphere ozone layer was observed in the South Pole, and it happened because of increased ultraviolet radiation infiltration over Antarctica. So ozone layer is situated in the stratosphere layer of atmosphere, and it protects us from dangerous ultraviolet ray. Without ozone layer, we would have developed cancer. So a hole in an ozone layer means a significant drop in ozone molecules in the layer, and at that time it was as large as that of United States, and it was discovered by a British team. And significant drop in ozone molecules happens because of certain gases. I mean, if we have more greenhouse gases in the ozone in the atmosphere, then those gases can interact with the ozone layer and can break down the ozone molecules. So this convention acts as a framework for international efforts to protect the ozone layer. However, it does not include any legally binding reduction goal for the use of CFC, chlorofluorocarbon. It is a greenhouse gas, but it actually interacts ozone, and it is actually very harmful for the ozone layer. So this particular gas is actually the main chemical agents causing ozone depletion. So we did not have any legally binding protocol or framework at that time in that convention, but those were laid in the Montreal Protocol in 1987. But in terms of universality, it is one of the most successful treaties of all time. It had been ratified by 197 countries. So now we have Montreal Protocol in 1987. It is actually it is actually a result of Vienna Convention, where we had the agreement, but we did not have any legally binding agreements. So in Montreal Protocol, it is an international treaty designed to protect the ozone layer by phasing out the production of numerous substances that are responsible for ozone depletion. So by Montreal Protocol, we actually stopped the use. We tried to stop the use of CFCs across the world. It was agreed on 26 August 1987, but entered into force on 26 January 1989. and since then it has undergone 8 revisions, and the latest one is 2016. As a result of the international agreement, the ozone hole in Antarctica is slowly recovering, and climate projections indicate that the ozone layer will return to the 1980 levels between 2050 and 2070. So now IPCC, a major breakthrough in climate change action. IPCC is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is a scientific and intergovernmental body set up at the request of member governments, and it is dedicated to the task of providing the world with an objective scientific view of climate change and its political and economic impacts. It was set up in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and United Nations Environment Programme. The IPCC does not carry out its own original research. Nor does it do the work of monitoring climate or related phenomena itself. It actually bases its assessment on the published literature, which includes peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed sources. Thousands of scientists and other experts contribute, usually on a voluntary basis without payment from the IPCC, to writing and review reports, which are then reviewed by the governments. The IPCC provides an internationally accepted authority on climate change, producing reports which have the agreement of leading climate scientists and the consensus of participating governments. So IPCC climate change report is actually kind of a comprehensive report on global climate change. It provides policymakers with regular assessments, and regular assessments may not annually, but the first assessment report was published in 1990, and the fifth assessment report we have it now in 2014, and currently IPCC is working to produce the sixth assessment report, which will be published in 2021. So now the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. It happened in 1992, 20 years after the first Global Environment Conference. It is also known as the Earth Summit or Rio Summit. It is particularly very significant because of the declaration and the outcomes. It was held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to reconcile the worldwide economic development with protection of the environment. Actually, the United Nations sought to help governments rethink economic development and find ways to halt the destruction of irreplaceable natural resources and pollution of the planet. The Earth Summit was the largest gathering of world leaders as of 1992, with 117 heads of state and representatives of 178 nations in all attending. So UNCED, in short, it has like four big outcomes. One is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in short UNFCCC. We'll talk about that a little later. Another one is UNCBD, United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. It is a binding treaty requiring nations to take inventories of their plants and wild animals and protect their endangered species. And now the Agenda 21, it is very important. It is an environmental action plan for the next century. It is not legally binding but forms the basis for a new international partnership for sustainable development and environmental protection all worldwide. The primary goal of Agenda 21 is to ensure that development proceeds in a sustainable manner. Another goal is to eliminate poverty throughout the world through better management of energy and natural resources and improvement of the quality of life by ensuring access to shelter and clean water, sewage and solid waste treatment. Agenda 21 also attempts to achieve the sustainable use of global and regional resources such as atmosphere, ocean, seas and fresh water and marine organisms. The final goal is to improve management of chemicals and wastes. So it is the Agenda 21. It's not just about climate change, it is actually the sustainable development overall. But the Rio Declaration, it consisted of 27 principles intended to guide countries in future sustainable development. So this particular conference, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, is particularly famous for the Sustainable Development Declarations. Now the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is a binding treaty that requires nations to reduce their emission of carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases thought to be responsible for global warming. However, the treaty stopped short of setting binding targets for emission reductions. Such targets were eventually established in an amendment to the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which was superseded by the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in 2015. The UNFCCC has 197 parties, which is participants countries, as of December 2015. The parties of the convention have met annually from 1995 in Conference of Parties, in short COP or COP, to assess the progress in dealing with climate change. So you might have heard about this term, these conferences of parties, or in short COP, like COP 10, COP 20, COP 21. So this means that is actually the conference of the UNFCCC parties. So Kyoto Protocol, it is very important in the for the 20th century. It is a legally binding agreement under which industrialized countries will reduce their collective emissions of greenhouse gases by 5.2% compared to the year 1990. It actually commits its parties by setting internationally binding emission reduction targets, the core idea. Recognizing that developed countries are principally responsible for the current high levels of greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere as a result of more than 150 years of industrial activity, the protocol places a heavier burden on developed nations under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So this 5.2% target, it is actually for the industrialized countries. They will reduce their collective emission of greenhouse gases by 5.2%, but you might think that it is very low. It is actually not low, because compared to the emission levels that would be expected by 2010, if without the protocol, this target represents a 29% cut of the emission. So this is actually a significant cut. So the goal is to lower the overall emission from 6 greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, and plectofluorinated carb chemicals. National targets range from 8% reduction for the European Union and some others to 7% for the US, 6% for Japan, 0% for Russia, and permitted increases of 8% for Australia and 10% for Iceland. So its first commitment period started in 2008 and ended in 2012. During the first commitment period, 37 industrialized countries and the European Community committed to reduce greenhouse gas emission to an average of 5% against 1990 levels. And during the second commitment period, parties committed to reduce greenhouse gas emission by at least 18% below 1990 levels in the 8-year period from 2013 to 2020. However, the composition of parties in the second commitment period is different from the first. So now the Paris Agreement, it is the most important agreement in the 21st century, because in this Paris Agreement, all the nations agreed to combat climate change and to accelerate and intensify the actions and investment needed for a sustainable low-carbon future. The central aim of this Paris Agreement is to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by keeping a global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Additionally, the agreement aims to increase the ability of countries to deal with the impacts of climate change and at making finance flows consistent with a low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient pathway. To reach these ambitious goals, appropriate mobilization and provision of financial resources, a new technology framework, and enhanced capacity building is to be put in place. And in this way, this agreement will support actions by developing countries um, and the most vulnerable countries, in line with their own national objectives. So this agreement requires all parties to put forward their best efforts through nationally determined contributions. Nationally determined contribution is actually when the nations determine how much they will contribute to the global emission. And the Paris Agreement overall, the idea was to somehow reduce the global emissions so that we can reduce the temperature, we can keep the limit the temperature increase further to 1.5 degrees Celsius below the above the pre-industrial levels. So, but the Trump administration recently, they said they are going to move out from the agreement, and it already has been declared, but officially the US cannot exit from the agreement before November 4, 2020. You'll discuss, you'll read opinion piece about, you'll read an opinion piece about this exit of US from Paris Agreement in the Blackboard. So this is all for today, and thank you very much.